It started on a Monday morning, the kind that usually smelled like black coffee and wet pine needles. I stepped outside, thermos in one hand, still in my slippers, and saw it. A neon orange slip, tucked beneath the wiper of my Ford Explorer. Bold letters screaming across the top. Parking violation vehicle in non-compliance with HOA guidelines. I blinked once, twice, thinking maybe I was misreading it. But no. It was there in ink, complete with a fake citation number, HOA insignia printed at the top, and what looked eerily like a badge watermark behind the text. The kicker, my SUV was parked in my own driveway. Not on the curb, not on the sidewalk. Square in the middle of the concrete slab I poured with my own two hands 15 years ago, back when my knees still bent without cracking. At first, I chuckled. Not because it was funny, because I thought it had to be a mistake, a prank from a teenager maybe. My neighborhood, Lakeside Pines, was quiet, overly quiet. The kind of place where hedges were measured, lawn heights were whispered about, and some folks took their community guidelines a little too personally. Still, I peeled off the slip, tucked it in my back pocket, and went on with my morning. But then it happened again. Tuesday, same car, same place, same type of warning. Only this time the slip was folded into a plastic sleeve, as if to officially protect the citation. And this one had a signature at the bottom. It read, Sergeant R. Bentley, HOA Patrol. My blood ran cold for half a second. Sergeant, since when did the HOA have ranks? I marched straight inside and pulled open the filing cabinet in the study. Years of paperwork, insurance documents, and neighborhood bylaws cluttered the drawer, but I found what I was looking for, the original HOA charter, issued the year I moved in. I'd only glanced at it once, back when Ellen, my wife, was still alive, and we were trying to figure out whether backyard chickens were allowed. Now I read it, line by line, and not one section mentioned enforcement powers. No mention of patrol officers. Certainly nothing about issuing tickets or citations on private property. Still, I wasn't one to jump to conclusions. I figured I'd ask around. Wednesday morning, I headed to the HOA office, a prefab building nestled between the community pool and the tennis courts. Inside, a young man in khakis and a pastel shirt sat at a desk, typing furiously on a tablet. "Can I help you?" he asked, barely looking up. "I'm looking for someone named Sergeant Bentley." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you mean Richard?" I waited. "He's our volunteer security officer. He does the neighborhood patrols. Real passionate guy. Helps out the board." "Volunteer," I repeated. The young man finally looked up. "Yes, sir. Is there a problem?" I pulled the slip from my jacket pocket and unfolded it slowly, laying it on the counter like a playing card in a bad poker hand. "He left this on my car," I said, "while it was parked in my driveway. I want to know if this has any legal standing." The guy stammered, I mean, it's a warning." "No, it's a fraud. It has a badge on it, a false citation number, and a rank designation that doesn't exist." He swallowed hard. "You tell Sergeant Bentley, if he steps foot on my property again with this nonsense, he'll be talking to someone with real authority." And then I left. That night, I expected it would end there. Most people, when confronted, back off. But not Richard Bentley. Thursday morning, I found a third slip. Only this time, it was hand-delivered in an envelope, sealed with a gold HOA sticker. Inside was a full-page document titled Notice of Non-Compliance, Multiple Violations. It cited imaginary codes, threatened fines up to $200, and included an image of my car, taken from the sidewalk, zoomed in, blurry, clearly shot with a smartphone. I felt my pulse spike. I'd dealt with worse, years ago. In a different life, I wore a badge myself, served as a field training officer for the county sheriff's department. I'd retired with full honors after 23 years, most of them uneventful, a few unforgettable. But this wasn't law enforcement. This was delusion. That evening, I decided to watch. I sat in the shadows of the porch, thermos in hand, lights off, waiting. At exactly 10:06 p.m., a white Ford Ranger rolled up the street. No markings, no city plate, just a magnetic sticker slapped on the side, Lakeside HOA Patrol. It stopped 2 houses down. The driver got out. A man, late 40s maybe, cargo pants, tactical boots, dark jacket, with a faux shoulder patch that read Lakeside Enforcement Division. Richard Bentley. He walked casually, not like someone taking a stroll, but like he owned the neighborhood. He approached my driveway, flashlight in hand, circled the vehicle, and pulled out a notepad. I stepped out from the shadows. "Evening," I said. He flinched, but quickly recovered. "Sir, your vehicle is in violation of HOA Code 6.2. There's no 6.2. It states that all visible vehicles must be. There is no 6.2, I repeated, and you're on my property without permission." He narrowed his eyes. "I'm authorized by the board." "Authorized to do what? Issue fake tickets, trespass." He puffed his chest. "You might want to calm down. Interfering with enforcement can lead to legal penalties." I stepped closer, slowly. "You're not law enforcement, Richard. You're not even licensed private security. You're a guy playing dress-up with a clipboard and an attitude." He pointed a finger at me. "You raise your voice again, and I'll call the sheriff's department." I smiled. "Do it." He hesitated. And that's when I pulled my wallet and flipped it open, showing him my retired badge. The look in his eyes shifted. Confusion, then fear. I didn't need to threaten. I didn't need to shout. I just stood there, calm and steady, badge in hand. "Richard," I said, "if I ever see you on this property again, it won't be me calling the sheriff. It'll be you being detained under citizen's arrest for impersonating an officer and trespassing." He backed away without another word, climbed into his truck, and disappeared into the night. I didn't sleep much, not because I was afraid, but because I knew men like Richard rarely acted alone. And if the HOA had given him that much rope, I didn't have to wait long for confirmation that Richard Bentley wasn't acting alone. The very next morning, I received an email from the HOA board with the subject line, "Ongoing Community Safety Initiative, Vehicle Compliance Reminder." It was a thinly veiled attempt to back him up, full of language like our volunteer security liaison, community enforcement support, and my personal favorite, non-confrontational observation and reporting. The email didn't mention me by name, but the implication was clear. I was the subject of their little reminder. That same day, Charlotte Reed, the board president, called me directly. I didn't even know she had my number. "Hi, David," she began, her voice sugary sweet but tight. "I just wanted to touch base after your little encounter with Richard." "Little encounter," I said flatly. "Charlotte, your boy impersonated a law enforcement officer, trespassed, and tried to intimidate me on my own property." She gave a tight laugh. "Richard's just trying to keep things orderly. People have been complaining." "Complaining about what?" I asked. She hesitated. "Your vehicle mainly. It's a bit large. My truck is within the HOA's size limits, and again, it's parked in my own driveway." She sighed. "We're just trying to maintain community aesthetics, David. You know how these things go." "I do," I replied. "I also know there's no clause in the CC&Rs that allows anyone from the HOA to issue tickets, wear a badge, or enforce anything on private property. You're towing a very thin legal line." There was a pause on her end. When she spoke again, the sweetness was gone. "Don't make this difficult," she said. "You've always been a decent neighbor. We don't want to escalate. You should have thought of that before letting Richard cosplay as a cop." I hung up. That's when I realized this wasn't just about Richard and his flashlight. It was about control. Charlotte and her board were using Richard to test how far they could push residents, how much overreach they could get away with. If cloaked in the language of safety and order, it wasn't going to stop with me. So I did what I always do. When the stakes are high, I prepared. That night, I went through my files again, not just the HOA charter, but the municipal code of our city. I cross-referenced state laws on impersonation, trespassing, and private security licensing. Richard Bentley had 0 credentials registered with the state. No private security license, no background check on file, no insurance bond, nothing. I called up a buddy of mine, Malcolm, who used to run the legal compliance division for the state's private security board, and asked him to verify it. He called back 2 hours later. "Not only is he not licensed," Malcolm said, "but if he's wearing a badge or suggesting any enforcement authority, that's a Class A misdemeanor at minimum. If he's detaining anyone or threatening citations, you might be looking at felony impersonation of an officer." I sat back, the weight of it settling in. Richard was breaking the law and Charlotte was enabling it. Saturday morning, I saw him again. Richard pulled into the neighborhood in his usual unmarked truck, magnetic HOA patrol sticker gleaming like it meant something. I waited by my garage. When he saw me, he slowed down, rolled down the window, and said smugly, "Morning, Mr. Thompson, just doing my rounds." "You're not allowed on my property," I reminded him. "You step 1 foot onto it, and I'm calling the sheriff." He smirked. You'd really waste their time over something this small. I walked toward him. Let me explain something to you, Richard. I trained half the sheriff's department before you ever picked up a clipboard. You're not just being a nuisance, you're breaking multiple state laws. His jaw tensed. I'm a security liaison, authorized by the board. No, you're not, I said. Calm but firm. You're a civilian with no license, no authority, and no right to act like a cop. That badge you're wearing, it's a prop. And if you flash it at the wrong person, you're going to jail. He tried to laugh it off, but his hand moved instinctively to cover the badge pinned to his vest. A cheap aluminum knockoff styled like a sheriff's star. It even had Community Enforcement Officer engraved on it. That's when I pulled out my phone and started recording. You want to talk about rights, I said. You're standing on HOA-owned common ground right now. And that means this conversation is happening in public space. He turned the key in his ignition. You'll regret this. No, I said, still recording. You will. That night, I uploaded the footage to a private folder and shared it with two local reporters I knew from back in the day. One of them, Laura McKay, had a segment called Neighborhood Watchdogs that focused on HOA abuse and overreach. She replied within minutes, "Can we come film an interview?" I told her to give me a week. I had something bigger in mind. In the meantime, I printed out laminated signs and posted them on either side of my driveway. Private property. No HOA access without warrant or legal authorization. Violators will be prosecuted. Simple, clear, legal. Richard didn't come back Sunday or Monday, but Charlotte did. She marched up to my porch with a clipboard and two other board members in tow, both of whom looked distinctly uncomfortable. We're here to conduct a compliance review, she announced. I didn't even open the screen door. Not without a 48-hour written notice, I replied. She smiled thinly. This is just a courtesy inspection. Then you can wave at the camera on your way out. I pointed to the newly installed doorbell cam and the motion sensor lights that now ringed my property. She took one look, then turned on her heel and walked away, but not before muttering loud enough for the mic to catch. He's going to regret this. 3 days later, I received a formal notice in the mail. Final violation. Non-compliance with HOA security measures. The alleged violation. Failure to allow HOA officers access to property for visual inspection. That was the last straw. I contacted my attorney. I drafted a cease and desist letter. And I began preparing my case not just to stop Richard, but to expose the entire scheme Charlotte had been running. I wasn't just defending my driveway anymore. I was about to dismantle their fake empire badge by badge, lie by lie. The next 2 weeks played out like something out of a bad neighborhood drama. Only this time, the actors weren't fictional, and the threats were real. Every other day, I received a new warning letter from the HOA. Each one more absurd than the last. One cited me for excessive driveway clutter, a toolbox I'd left open while changing my truck's oil. Another accused me of visual disrepair because a tree in my front yard had a slightly leaning branch. The pièce de resistance was a fine for emotional disruption to community peace. Whatever that meant. Each document came signed by the HOA secretary and footnoted with invented codes that didn't match any official regulation in our covenants, conditions, and restrictions. It was like they had a random HOA rule generator. But I wasn't the only one they were targeting. At the community mailboxes, I started running into neighbors I hadn't spoken with in years. At first, there was hesitation in their voices, a cautious friendliness. Then one evening, Mrs. Abigail, who lived across the cul-de-sac, walked over with a tin of cookies and something folded in her hand. I got this yesterday, she said, passing me a letter stamped with the HOA's logo. They fined me $75 for leaving my trash bins out an extra hour. I opened it. The language was eerily similar to mine. They've never cared before, she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. But since you stood up to them, it clicked. This wasn't about violations, it was retaliation. Charlotte and her board were using fines as a pressure tactic, painting me as a troublemaker, and punishing anyone who showed even a flicker of solidarity. They wanted to isolate me. Too bad they didn't know me better. My years on the force had taught me a simple truth. Bullies escalate when you stand your ground, but they also expose themselves when they go too far. They go. The moment came on a Friday afternoon. I was in my garage, sorting through old tools, when I noticed Richard Bentley's white Ford Ranger roll to a stop, not in the street, but halfway up my driveway. He climbed out, with the same fake badge, clipboard in hand, and an air of smug entitlement. I stepped outside and raised a hand. "You're trespassing again." He ignored me, walking around my truck, examining it like a state trooper at a traffic stop. Then, without a word, he bent down, pulled out a yellow booting device, and began attaching it to my rear tire. I blinked. "You touched that car, Richard, and I swear to God." He stood up and turned to face me, smug as ever. HOA Code 4.9 authorizes vehicle immobilization for repeat violations. "That's not a real code," I snapped. "There is no booting authority. And this isn't a public parking lot, this is my property." He shrugged. "Call it community enforcement." I stepped forward, close enough to see the glint of sweat on his temple. "You have 10 seconds to remove that, or I'm calling the sheriff." Richard didn't move. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a laminated ID card. Not a state-issued license, not anything official, just a cheaply made card that said, "Lakeside HOA Enforcement Division, Sergeant Richard Bentley, officer in charge." My stomach turned. That was the last straw. I walked back inside, calmly, without a word. What Richard didn't know was that my garage wasn't just filled with tools and holiday decorations. It also housed a locked steel cabinet. Inside my retired law enforcement credentials, a pair of handcuffs I kept for personal security, and a body camera I occasionally used when hiking remote areas. I clipped the camera to my shirt, took the cuffs, and returned outside. Richard was now photographing the truck, circling it like a predator. I walked straight up to him, holding out a printed letter. "This is a formal cease and desist from my attorney. You're violating it right now." He snorted. "You think I care about your lawyer? You're the one causing problems here." I stepped between him and the truck. "Remove the boot." He squared up. "Or what?" And that's when he made his mistake. He reached for my arm, a light grab, barely forceful, but enough. Enough to constitute physical contact. Enough to give me the right to act. In one swift motion, I twisted free, turned him around, and cuffed him. He gasped, panicked. "What the hell are you doing? You just committed assault on private property, impersonated an officer, and violated multiple state laws," I said calmly. "And I have it all on video." He struggled. "You can't do this. You're not a cop anymore." "No," I said, "but I'm still licensed for citizen's arrest under Florida Statute 90115. And you just handed me every reason I need." I walked him to the porch railing, cuffed one of his wrists to the iron support, and called the sheriff's department. 20 minutes later, 2 real deputies arrived uniformed, fully authorized, and very curious. They took my statement, watched the footage from my body cam, and examined Richard's badge, clipboard, and fake ID. Within the hour, Richard Bentley was escorted into a squad car. Charlotte showed up just as the doors closed. She looked like someone had punched her in the stomach. "This is outrageous," she shouted at the deputies. He was doing his job. One of the officers turned. "Ma'am, he's not licensed, certified, or authorized to enforce anything. He's being charged with impersonating an officer, criminal trespass, and unlawful detainment attempt." I stepped forward, "And I'll be pressing charges for harassment and property tampering." She sputtered. "You can't do that. You're setting a dangerous precedent." "No," I said. "You did that the moment you handed a delusional man a fake badge and let him run wild." Richard was driven away. Charlotte stood frozen, her phone trembling in her hand. I knew this wasn't the end. But for the first time in weeks, I felt the ground under my feet again. Solid, secure. I'd warned them. They hadn't listened. Now they would. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a stack of documents spread before me like a war map. The adrenaline from yesterday's takedown hadn't fully worn off, but my mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. Richard Bentley's arrest had lit a fire in the neighborhood and in me. But if I'd learned anything during my time on the force, it was that one arrest doesn't dismantle a system. You had to follow the paper trail. So that's exactly what I did. First, I contacted the county clerk's office and requested all permits, registrations, and licenses related to Lakeside HOA Enforcement Division. Unsurprisingly, there were none. No business license, no employee IDs. Nothing beyond a vague mention in one HOA board meeting agenda, where they had approved the formation of a volunteer compliance team. Next, I reached out to the State Department of Consumer Affairs to see if anyone under the name Richard Bentley had a registered private security license or any record of working in law enforcement. The answer came back quickly and emphatically, no record found. Then came the HOA meeting minutes. The documents were available to all residents, though the board never made them easy to access. I dug through months of PDFs, most written in dry bureaucratic jargon. But buried in the October minutes, I found it. Motion approved to allow Richard Bentley to act as compliance liaison, responsible for voluntary security efforts within the community. No legal authority implied. Board indemnified of all liability. There it was in writing. They had given Richard a fancy title, encouraged him to patrol the neighborhood, and knowingly denied him legal authority. Worse, they'd voted to indemnify themselves, which meant they were well aware he could cause trouble. I printed it all out, every damning page. Then I started knocking on doors. My first stop was Philip Dawson, a Vietnam vet who lived 3 houses down. He opened the door slowly, cautious until he saw my face. "David," he said, "heard what happened yesterday." I nodded, figured you might. He stepped aside. "Come on in." Philip had lived in Lakeside Pines longer than anyone. He remembered when the HOA was a casual association of neighbors who just wanted the pool cleaned and the bushes trimmed. He didn't take kindly to authority, especially fake authority. I showed him the documents. His hands trembled slightly as he read. "I knew something was off," he murmured. "Richard's been sniffing around my shed. Said my flagpole was too tall. That I could be fined." Philip's flagpole was regulation height. I helped install it myself. "I'm gathering evidence," I told him. "If we can prove the HOA acted recklessly and knowingly enabled impersonation, we can push for a formal investigation." He looked at me with something between relief and resolve. "Whatever you need, I'm in." Philip wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, I spoke with a dozen neighbors, each with a story. Richard issuing warnings. Richard peering into garages. Richard threatening fines. Some of them had kept the notices. Others had deleted emails, but remembered details. And not one of them had seen a shred of actual identification. I compiled the testimonies, backed them with dates, and built a timeline that painted a clear picture. Richard Bentley was a rogue actor, but he wasn't acting alone. The HOA board empowered him and tried to protect themselves from the fallout. It was time to bring it to the city. At City Hall, I met with Councilman Rivera, an old contact from my sheriff days. We sat in his modest office while I laid out the evidence. He whistled low as he flipped through the file. "This is substantial, David. If half of this holds up, the HOA could be looking at serious liability, impersonation, harassment, maybe even conspiracy." He agreed to initiate a formal complaint with the city attorney's office and launch an internal investigation into HOA practices in our district. He also promised to send a city inspector to verify whether Richard's actions had crossed into legal territory, which, of course, they had. I left City Hall that day, feeling more than victorious. I felt righteous. But I also knew that retaliation was coming. It arrived 2 days later. A certified letter, hand-delivered by a courier, with a bold heading, "Notice of HOA Violation Hearing." It stated that I had been cited for hostile behavior toward HOA representatives, public disruption, and failure to comply with safety initiatives. They scheduled a hearing before the board to determine disciplinary action, including potential suspension of community privileges and possible eviction recommendation. Eviction. I laughed aloud when I read the word. They were overreaching again, and now in writing. But the gravity of it wasn't lost on me. These weren't people who played fair. They were willing to twist bylaws, fabricate offenses, and threaten livelihoods, just to protect their ego and power. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. I emailed a formal response, requesting a rescheduling of the hearing so my attorney could attend. Then I did something that made Charlotte's skin crawl. I filed a civil harassment restraining order against Richard Bentley. I knew the arrest hadn't deterred him fully. Word on the street was that he was still communicating with the board, positioning himself as a victim, and even posting online about ungrateful neighbors who don't appreciate discipline. The restraining order added teeth to the case. It also forced the board to distance themselves from him publicly. At the same time, I contacted the local newspaper and scheduled an interview. I brought my folder of evidence, body cam footage, HOA meeting minutes, and personal testimonies. The reporter, a sharp-eyed woman named Sierra Tran, was fascinated. We've had stories of HOAs abusing power, she said. But this is next level. The article was published the following Sunday, under the headline, HOA Gone Rogue, Volunteer Cop Cuffed by Retired Officer. It went viral. The online version gained thousands of comments. Former residents, neighbors, and HOA victims from across the state chimed in. Some thanked me. Others shared similar horror stories. The pressure mounted. Charlotte sent out a community-wide letter, calling the article inflammatory and inaccurate, accusing me of tarnishing the reputation of the neighborhood. But no one was listening anymore. People had seen the footage, read the documents. They believed me. The narrative had shifted. I wasn't a lone troublemaker. I was the whistleblower. The one who had the guts to say what others were too afraid to whisper. I stood in my backyard that evening, watching the sun dip behind the pine trees that lined the man-made lake. The same lake Richard had tried to patrol. The same lake I now knew had legal complications of its own complications the HOA didn't want anyone to uncover. That was coming next. But for now, I let the silence settle, because for the first time in months, it wasn't being shattered by boots on gravel or bogus citations flapping on my windshield. Just the sound of wind through the trees and the steady beat of justice, coming for those who had overstepped. By the time the HOA hearing rolled around, the community felt like it was holding its breath. The story had circulated not just in our neighborhood, but throughout the county. People I hadn't spoken to in years were stopping me in the grocery store to offer support. Even my former colleagues from the sheriff's department reached out to say they'd seen the video and were glad someone was standing up to the rising tide of HOA overreach. But I knew Charlotte Reed wasn't going down without a fight. The hearing was scheduled for 6 p.m. on a Wednesday evening, held in the community clubhouse, the same place they usually hosted potlucks and bingo nights. But this night was different. Rows of folding chairs were set up like a courtroom, with a long table at the front, where Charlotte and the rest of the board sat in a line like a tribunal. I arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a suit not my usual wardrobe, but I wanted to send a message. With me was my attorney, Alex Nguyen, a no-nonsense civil litigator who specialized in HOA disputes. He had the perfect blend of calm and steel in his tone, and he'd read every page of the file we'd assembled. When we walked in, the room went silent. Charlotte's lips tightened, and Richard Bentley, somehow still walking freely pending arraignment, sat to the far right, in a neck brace that wasn't there the day before. A performance, no doubt. The HOA secretary, a woman named Marla, tapped a gavel on the table, as if this were an actual courtroom. We are here today to review the actions of resident David Thompson, in light of several violations and behavioral concerns brought forth by the board. I glanced around. Every chair was filled. Many neighbors stood along the back wall. Some nodded at me. Others kept their faces neutral. But there were more of us than them. Charlotte took the lead, reading off a list of alleged offenses: obstruction of HOA duties, intimidation of a volunteer, public shaming of HOA leadership, and creating a hostile neighborhood environment. Alex leaned in and whispered, "They're hanging themselves." I stood when it was my turn to speak. "My name is David Thompson," I said clearly, my voice firm but not loud. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 10 years. I served 2 decades in law enforcement, earned multiple commendations, and have no history of disruptive behavior. What I do have is a firm understanding of the law and a deep respect for fairness." I gestured toward Richard. This man, Richard Bentley, falsely claimed to be an enforcement officer, trespassed on private property, and used a fabricated badge to intimidate residents. When I exercised my legal right to a citizen's arrest in response to a physical confrontation, I followed every protocol and contacted real authorities immediately. A murmur passed through the room. Charlotte tried to interrupt Mr. Thompson, but Alex raised his hand. "He has the floor. Let him finish." I held up the laminated HOA meeting minutes. "This document shows the board knew Richard had no real authority, yet you empowered him anyway. And now you're trying to cover your tracks by inventing violations and threatening me with eviction." I pointed to the audience. "Ask yourselves, do any of you feel safer because Richard drove around with a fake badge? taking pictures of your homes. Did anyone vote for that? The silence that followed was louder than any argument. Charlotte's face flushed, but she pressed forward. We believe Mr. Thompson's actions, while perhaps legally defensible, have created undue tension in our community. Alex stood. So you admit the legality of his actions? She hesitated. That's not the point. Actually, it's exactly the point, Alex replied. Because your HOA charter does not authorize armed patrols, impersonation of law enforcement, or the use of any enforcement badge. You are not a governing body. You are a management association, bound by contract and local statutes. He laid out several printouts, Florida statutes on impersonation, trespassing, and HOA liability. What your board has done is not just unethical, it's illegal. Charlotte began to protest again, but the tide had turned. People in the room were shifting. Heads nodded, eyes widened. Neighbors began whispering to one another. Then Philip Dawson stood up from the back row. David helped install my flagpole, he said, his voice strong despite his years. Richard threatened to have it cut down, said it was unauthorized vertical structure. That was a lie. More neighbors followed. I got fined for an American flag on my porch. Richard opened my mailbox. He took pictures of my daughter's car and said it wasn't registered. It became a chorus of frustration, long-buried grievances, surfacing at last. Charlotte banged the gavel. This is not a public forum. But no one was listening to her anymore. Alex calmly turned to me. I believe this qualifies as community support. Charlotte, visibly rattled, called for a recess. The board left the room, disappearing into a back office. The audience remained, buzzing with quiet outrage. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, the board returned, looking paler than before. Charlotte cleared her throat. The board has decided not to proceed with any disciplinary action at this time, she said, through gritted teeth. The matter is closed. But it wasn't, because the damage had been done not by me, but by them. And now the light was on. After the meeting, people surrounded me. Thank you, David. You really stood up for all of us. My son wants to talk to you. He's thinking about law school. It wasn't just about the HOA anymore. It was about community, trust, truth. As I walked home, the night air felt lighter. But I also knew what came next. Because if they'd violated trust in one area, I had to ask, what else were they hiding? It was time to dig deeper. Into the finances, into the land deeds, into the power they thought no one would challenge. And I was just getting started. 2 days after the HOA backed down at the hearing, I thought naively that maybe we'd turned a corner. The community had rallied. The board had been embarrassed. And Richard Bentley, last we heard, was awaiting arraignment with a court date set in 3 weeks. But with people like Charlotte and Richard, public embarrassment doesn't humble them. It provokes them. And when narcissism is backed into a corner, it bites. It started with a rumor. Someone left an anonymous flyer in neighbors' mailboxes, titled The Danger, Living Among Us, with a grainy photo of me during the arrest, mid-motion, hand on Richard's shoulder. The headline read, Retired Cop Turns Vigilante. It claimed I had illegally detained a community volunteer, was known for aggression during my time on the force, and had a record of misconduct. All of it was fabricated. No name or HOA logo was on the paper, but everyone knew where it came from. It didn't stop there. The HOA newsletter that month omitted my name from the neighborhood directory, a petty move, but deliberate. And suddenly, when I tried to book the community room for a veterans brunch I hosted every spring, I was told it was unavailable for private use pending policy revisions. The final straw came one hot Saturday afternoon. I was in my front yard, planting a new bed of wildflowers along the drive, when I heard footsteps behind me on the gravel. I turned, and there he was, Richard Bentley. No badge, no clipboard, but the same smug posture, same predator eyes. I stood slowly, wiping the dirt off my hands. You're not supposed to be here, he smirked. Funny, no one told me that restraining order covers sidewalks. You're within 20 feet of my front door. You gonna cuff me again, Sheriff, he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. My jaw tensed. I didn't respond. He took a step closer. I came to tell you something, man to man. I'm not interested. He didn't back off. I've got friends on the board, people who owe me, he said. Charlotte might play politics, but me, I keep receipts. I stared at him. Are you threatening me? He smiled. Just saying your little moment in the spotlight, it's going to burn out fast. And when it does, nobody's going to back you. I took a breath, slow and steady. You're violating a court order. He shrugged. Prove it. So I did. I reached into my front pocket not for a weapon, but for my phone. I'd been recording since the moment he appeared. Richard's expression changed immediately. "You think you're clever," he started, stepping forward again. And that's when I saw it. He reached for the latch on my truck's driver's side door. A motion so quick, so instinctive, he likely didn't even think about it. But I did. He was trying to provoke me, or worse, plant something, cause damage, fabricate another incident. My blood surged with fury. I stepped between him and the door, one hand out, back away. Now, he froze, then leaned in close, voice a low hiss. "You're gonna regret crossing me." That was it. I called 911. The dispatcher answered in under 5 seconds, and I gave them the address, explained the court order, and informed them of a repeat violation. By the time the first patrol car rolled into view, Richard had retreated to the sidewalk, arms crossed like a sulking child. The officer, a young man I didn't recognize, stepped out and approached me first. I handed over the restraining order, the footage, and calmly explained what had happened. Then, in front of half a dozen neighbors peeking through curtains and doorways, Richard Bentley was arrested again for violating a court order, attempted trespass, and harassment. The handcuffs clicked on, without ceremony. Charlotte showed up 20 minutes later, visibly flustered. She tried to speak to the officers, but they shut her down quickly, citing the open investigation. The neighbors, they didn't say a word, but they watched. They saw everything. And the power dynamics of our neighborhood started to shift. The next morning, someone slid a handwritten note under my door. It said, "Thank you. You're the only one who's ever stood up to him. Keep going." No signature, just those words. That same day, I received an unexpected call from a woman named Deborah, an HOA board member I had never spoken to directly. She sounded nervous. "I can't talk long," she said, "but I think you should look into the lakefront maintenance budget." I blinked. "Excuse me." "There's money missing," she whispered. "Thousands, maybe tens of thousands, transferred out of the general fund into something called Community Compliance Initiatives." Richard's title that came with a budget. My stomach sank. "Do you have documents?" She hesitated. "Not yet, but I'm going to get them." Before she hung up, she said one more thing. "Be careful. Charlotte is not just petty, she's connected." And just like that, the scope of the conflict expanded. This wasn't about fake badges anymore. It wasn't even about Richard. It was about something deeper, darker. Power, money, control. And if they were willing to go this far to silence me over a driveway dispute, I had to wonder, what would they do to protect the real secrets? The days that followed Richard's second arrest were a strange mixture of tension and vindication. Half the neighborhood walked on eggshells. The other half walked taller. There were more conversations on sidewalks, more nods of acknowledgement, and even the occasional tray of cookies left on my porch. But I knew better than to think we were in the clear. Deborah's phone call had opened a door I couldn't ignore. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at the HOA's annual budget report. I'd requested a copy from the management company that oversaw our HOA's accounting, citing my right as a dues-paying member. What I received looked like the usual spreadsheet of landscaping, pool maintenance, and admin costs. But one line item stood out, like a sore thumb. Community Compliance Initiatives, $28,450. That number hadn't existed the year before. I cross-referenced the HOA board meeting minutes. In the July session, a vague reference was made to enhancing community compliance visibility, followed by a motion to allocate additional funds to support proactive enforcement practices. Proactive enforcement, that was bureaucratic code for Richard. But where did the money go? I called Alex, my attorney, and we dug in together. Over the next 72 hours, we followed the trail. And what we found turned my stomach. Charlotte had approved payments, 5 of them made out to a company called RBT Solutions, over the past 6 months. The total $27,600, just under the compliance line budget. A quick business license search revealed that RBT Solutions was a sole proprietorship, registered under Richard Bentley's name. The business purpose, neighborhood, consultation, and compliance enforcement. I nearly laughed if it weren't so dangerous. He'd created a fake company, been approved by the board, and paid with HOA funds our dues to essentially terrorize us, with fabricated authority. But the worst part, no one else on the board seemed to know. Deborah confirmed it when I met her at the edge of the lake one evening. She looked tired, hollowed out by guilt. He told Charlotte he had a team, said he'd patrol, keep crime down, scare off loiterers, she said. She sold it to us like he was a professional contractor. I handed her a folder containing the business registry, the payment history, and screenshots of Richard's now deleted HOA officer posts on social media. She covered her mouth. Oh God, we need a forensic audit, I said. And if Charlotte tries to block it, we go public. Again, Deborah hesitated. She's going to fight. She has friends at the management company. They've looked the other way for years. Not anymore, I said, not with receipts. That weekend, Deborah and two other board members, quietly encouraged by growing neighborhood unrest, called an emergency board session. They didn't tell Charlotte until the morning of. But by the time she arrived, the room was full. Nearly half the community had shown up, including neighbors I hadn't seen in months. People brought chairs, water bottles, notebooks. You could feel it in the air something was breaking loose. Charlotte walked in with her clipboard and practiced smile. When she saw Deborah sitting in the chair normally reserved for the board president, the smile faltered. "What is this?" she asked, eyes darting from face to face. Deborah stood. Her voice was even. "This is a special session, called under Section 4 of the HOA bylaws. We're voting on a motion to initiate a third-party financial audit of the HOA's last 2 fiscal years." Charlotte scoffed. "That's absurd. We already have audits done by the management company, which you handpicked someone called from the crowd." Charlotte's jaw clenched. "This is nothing but a witch hunt." "No," Deborah replied. "It's accountability." The vote was held on the spot. Every board member except Charlotte voted in favor of the audit. Then came the second motion, a vote of no confidence in the board president. Charlotte stood frozen. She tried to argue, tried to spin, said it was an attack by a disgruntled former officer with a chip on his shoulder, but it didn't matter. The community had spoken. When the vote came through 4-1, she stood in silence for a moment, then grabbed her files and walked out without another word. I stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, as Deborah took over the rest of the meeting. It wasn't celebration I felt. It was relief, a slow, cautious kind. But I also knew we were far from done, because the audit would take weeks. And if Charlotte and Richard had funneled money this easily, there was a chance they'd done it before, or worse, planned something bigger. The next day, I got an unexpected call from an attorney representing the developer who originally built our lake. "We've been made aware," he said, "that your HOA may be misrepresenting their control over waterfront access and easement rights. We'd like to discuss the original deed." I sat up straight in my chair, because that was the thread I'd only begun to tug. The lake, the view they'd weaponized against me, might not belong to them at all. It might belong to me. The attorney's name was Marcus Delaney. He represented a dissolved development company called Greenridge Estates LLC, the group that had originally designed and built our entire neighborhood 2 decades ago, including the lake. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of voice that had read thousands of contracts and missed nothing. "We've been reviewing title transfers," he said, "and came across several inconsistencies in the HOA's filings. You might want to look into Lot 17A. That name struck a chord immediately. Lot 17A was the long, narrow strip of land that wrapped around the southern bend of the lake, the very portion that the HOA had declared a community greenway years ago, and used to block my dock construction. Only, I had always suspected something was off. Years ago, when I moved in, the property line on the digital map from my realtor's portal had extended suspiciously close to the lake's edge. But every time I asked about access, the HOA responded vaguely, citing common property and exclusive easement arrangements. Now I understood why. Delaney offered to email me a digital copy of the original plat map and deed documents, along with a scanned copy of a title record dated 4 years before the HOA even existed. When I opened the file, my heart started pounding. There it was. Lot 17A, originally marked not as common area, but as a privately transferable parcel, included in a 3-lot bundle bought by the first owner of my home. It had never been legally transferred to the HOA. Instead, the HOA had simply assumed control, fencing off the land, landscaping it, and claiming it as a shared amenity space for the community. No title change, no notarized document, just a silent land grab. I cross-checked the records at the county recorder's office. The parcel ID matched mine. Legally, I owned it. That strip of land where they'd blocked my dock, written me up for unauthorized landscaping, and accused me of trespassing was mine. And with it came legal access to the lake and full authority to decide who else could use that shoreline. My hands trembled slightly as I printed everything out. It was like discovering a hidden key in a house you'd lived in for years, one that unlocked a door they'd boarded up and told you to ignore. I called Alex. This isn't just a fight over policy anymore, I said. This is a fight over land rights. They've illegally seized and enforced control over private property. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "We're not just going to fight this in a meeting. We're going to file suit." We spent the next week building the case, verified deeds, county land records, GIS maps, HOA newsletters showing the timeline of their false claims, and even emails from Charlotte, where she threatened to fine me over altering HOA-controlled waterfront. She'd sent those to dozens of residents, public proof of her misrepresentation. Then we took it one step further. Alex filed for a temporary restraining order against the HOA, preventing them from conducting any work, enforcement, or landscaping on Lot 17A until the dispute was resolved. We served the notice directly to the new acting HOA president, Deborah. Her hand shook when she read it, but she nodded. "I'll cooperate," she said softly. I didn't know. I'm sorry. Charlotte, however, was a different story. She went ballistic. 2 days after the TRO was served, she sent an email blast to the neighborhood, claiming I was trying to privatize the lake and steal community resources. She called me vindictive and accused me of weaponizing technicalities to hurt everyone. But this time, people didn't bite. Neighbors knocked on my door not to criticize, but to ask questions. Real questions. Is it true? Did they really never own the shoreline? What happens to our lake use? And I told them the truth. I wasn't cutting anyone off. I wasn't putting up gates, or banning kayaks, or charging access. I just wanted the harassment to stop. The fake patrols, the fines, the fences they put up without permission. I wanted clarity and fairness. And slowly, word began to spread. The narrative flipped. I wasn't trying to take something away. I was taking back what had always been mine. The hearing for the property dispute was set for early the following month. But Charlotte wasn't waiting for court. She filed a counterclaim, a bold, baseless accusation that I had forged documents and manipulated GIS data. It was desperate, reckless, but it triggered something we hadn't expected: a county investigation. Because when officials reviewed the claim, they didn't find fraud on my part. They found that the HOA had failed to register several land parcels altogether, including shared spaces near the tennis courts and the community center that had been built partially across an unregistered easement. And just like that, the scope widened again. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about a decade of mismanagement, deception, and likely tax fraud. Reporters started calling. Then city inspectors showed up. The HOA management company resigned, citing unrecoverable trust violations, and neighbors who had once kept quiet started coming forward. One woman revealed that Charlotte had waived her son-in-law's landscaping violations after he donated patio furniture to the pool area. Another resident shared that Richard had offered to let a violation slide if she agreed to report her neighbor for paint tone non-compliance. It was a house of cards, and it was crumbling fast. The night before the court hearing, I stood at the edge of the lake. The moon reflected softly across the water, the air still and heavy with the scent of pine. I remembered when I first moved here. The quiet promise of this place, the simple dream of peace, community, home. And I thought about how far they'd pushed me, just for asserting what was mine. But tomorrow, the records would speak, and the shoreline would no longer be a weapon. It would be my proof, my justice, my line in the sand. The morning of the hearing, I rose before the sun. I made coffee, but it sat untouched. My stomach churned, with a strange blend of anticipation and the silent dread that comes before something irreversible. For months, I'd fought with words, with deeds, with facts. Today, it would all be laid bare before the law. The courthouse was a modest building, all beige tile and tired chairs. But that morning it felt grand. Alex, my attorney, arrived early. Flanked by 2 junior associates, he carried a leather binder. With the evidence, we'd painstakingly compiled the original deed to Lot A, the developer's map, the county title records, emails, receipts, and testimonies from other neighbors. The defendant's bench was occupied by Charlotte and her newly hired legal team, different from the one who'd previously filed counterclaims. Apparently, her last lawyer had quietly dropped her after the county launched an investigation into the HOA's financial irregularities. Richard Bentley, unsurprisingly, was not in attendance. His absence was conspicuous and, frankly, telling. The courtroom filled quickly, not just with lawyers and clerks, but with neighbors, dozens of them. Deborah sat near the front, her expression resolute. Behind her were people I barely knew by name, but who'd been following every twist and turn since that first fake citation landed on my windshield. The judge, a calm and meticulous man named Judge Alan Marsh, entered with the sort of gravity that silenced the entire room. We began with opening statements. Alex kept it simple. The HOA had overstepped their bounds for years, and now the law had caught up. The land lot 17A was never theirs, and their attempts to enforce authority over it had violated both civil and criminal statutes. Charlotte's new attorney tried to pivot. The HOA acted with the belief they were managing community land in good faith, he said. If paperwork was incomplete, it was clerical, not malicious. But we had the receipts. Alex produced the original deed, signed and notarized years before the HOA's existence. He walked the court through the sequence, the land parcel that had been ignored during the title transfers, then quietly claimed by the HOA without proper process. Then came the emails, the ones where Charlotte threatened fines for activities on her lakefront despite lacking any legal documentation, the ones where she dismissed concerns from other board members, insisting we don't need to show them anything. They'll back down. Then we played a recording of voicemail Charlotte left for a resident who'd asked too many questions. If you side with him, don't expect the HOA to take care of your landscaping budget next year. You could feel the atmosphere in the room shift. It wasn't just about legal ownership anymore. It was about abuse. Next came testimony from Deborah. She described how Charlotte had personally approved Richard's patrols and paid him from a discretionary budget without any formal vote. It wasn't compliance, Deborah said. It was control. Another neighbor stepped forward to recount how she'd been fined for walking her dog along lot 17A, despite the fact that it was technically my land. And then I took the stand. I described how it started: the fake citations, the harassment, the manipulation. I spoke of being followed, filmed, and threatened by someone impersonating a police officer. I held up the badge Richard used. I showed the receipts I was forced to gather to defend my own home. But I didn't stop there. I spoke about why it mattered, about how veterans like me retire to places like this, hoping for peace, about how single parents, seniors, and young families expect protection from HOAs, not oppression, and how, if I hadn't fought back, how many more would have been quietly pushed into compliance. There was silence when I stepped down. Not dramatic silence, just the kind that comes when people are finally seeing something clearly. The judge recessed briefly, then returned with his verdict. Based on the overwhelming preponderance of evidence, he began. It is the finding of this court that the HOA, under the direction of its former president Charlotte Reed, exercised unauthorized control over private property and improperly funded non-sanctioned enforcement activities. He paused, then continued. Ownership of Lot A is hereby affirmed to Mr. David Thompson. Furthermore, the HOA shall cease all action, construction, regulation, or interference pertaining to this property, effective immediately. Mr. Thompson is awarded damages in the amount of $48,000 to cover legal fees, emotional distress, and loss of peaceful enjoyment. Gasps rippled through the room. Charlotte's face collapsed into her hands. Her lawyer stared at the desk. But the judge wasn't finished. This case also raises concerns that extend beyond this courtroom. A full audit of the HOA's financial and procedural conduct is recommended and will be referred to the appropriate authorities. He banged the gavel once. I didn't smile. I just exhaled a long, quiet breath I felt like I'd been holding for months. Outside the courthouse, neighbors approached me slowly at first, then more freely. I had no idea how bad it was. Thank you for standing up. I hope you stay. We need you. I nodded and thanked them. Not because I needed their praise, but because I knew something had changed. Not just for me, but for them. The next week, the new HOA board, Deborah, and 3 recently elected members scheduled a community forum. For the first time in years, residents could speak openly without fear of retaliation. Questions flew, suggestions were taken seriously, and I was invited to join the advisory committee. Not as an enforcer, but as a steward. Meanwhile, I returned to my land. Lot 17A had never looked so alive. Neighbors came to visit. Children skipped rocks. One woman began sketching the trees at sunset. The lake, once a source of division, had become a place of quiet reunion. I built a small footbridge at one end, just wide enough for 2 people to sit and watch the water drift by. I didn't put up a gate. I didn't hang a sign. But if I had, it would have said, "This is what happens when one person stands up. This is what happens when truth finds daylight." It had been 3 months since the verdict. The weight of the legal battle had lifted, but the echoes of it remained in the emails I still received from strangers, in the newspaper articles still pinned to the bulletin board at the local diner, and in the quiet nods from neighbors who passed me on their morning walks. I wasn't the same man who had moved here, hoping for peace and proximity to a lake. I was something more, a protector of peace, and somehow, without intending to, I had become a symbol. The newly restructured HOA was functioning more like a council than a regime. Deborah led with transparency and humility. The board meetings were now public, with minutes posted online and community votes determining all major changes. No more secret citations, no more fake cops, no more Charlotte. The audit had uncovered tens of thousands in misappropriated funds. The county began pursuing formal charges. Charlotte's name was no longer whispered with power, but with a cautionary tone, like a ghost from a darker time. Richard Bentley pled guilty to impersonating an officer and was sentenced to a year of probation, banned from setting foot in the neighborhood for 5 years. His silence, once used to intimidate, now just echoed his shame. But my focus wasn't on them anymore. I had work to do. I began slowly improving Lot 17, not to make a point, but to make it beautiful. I laid out a winding gravel path and planted drought-resistant wildflowers along the edges. I built a rustic wooden pergola near the shoreline with 2 long benches underneath, perfect for evening reflections or early morning coffee. One day, a teenager came by with a sketchpad. "You mind if I draw here?" she asked. "Not at all," I replied. "This place is for all of us. I just happen to hold the deed." She laughed. It was genuine. That simple interaction reminded me why I fought not just for legal clarity, but for emotional clarity. For a neighborhood where the rules serve the people, not the other way around. The lake's water level was lower than usual that summer, but it reflected the sky better than ever. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt peaceful. Every ripple was its own kind of celebration. At the next community event, an ice cream social organized by the new board, I was asked to speak. I didn't prepare much, just a few thoughts scratched into a notebook. When I stood up at the podium, I looked out and saw faces I once feared would report me, find me, film me. Now they waited, hopeful. Some with kids on their laps, some holding hands with their partners. I cleared my throat. I moved here because of this lake, because I thought it promised peace. But I didn't realize that peace doesn't come from water or trees. It comes from fairness, from respect. We didn't just change a board or win a case. We reclaimed our voice. And that's the kind of neighborhood I want to live in. Applause wasn't thunderous. It didn't need to be. It was steady, sincere. Afterward, Deborah approached me and handed me a framed certificate. "In appreciation for your courage," it read, "and your commitment to the truth." I hung it not in my house, but under the pergola by the lake. That's where it belonged. In the quiet weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Letters started arriving from other states, Arizona, Oregon, even Maine. People wrote to share how their HOAs had taken over too much, silenced too many, and how they felt alone in their fight. They asked for advice, for encouragement, so I gave it to them. I started a blog, The Lake Line, a small place where I shared my story, offered resources, linked legal templates, and most importantly, reminded people they had a right to push back. The blog grew quickly. Comments poured in. One woman wrote, "I thought I was crazy for questioning our board. But then I read your story. Now I'm organizing our first open meeting. Another man wrote, they fined me for parking my own truck in my own driveway. Your post helped me get that dismissed. Thank you. Each message reminded me when we protect our boundaries, physical or emotional, we make space for others to do the same. Late one September afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the lake in strokes of gold, I sat on the bench under the pergola and listened to the wind moving through the reeds. A young boy rode past on a bicycle, waving as he went. My heart was quiet, not empty, not angry, just steady. The HOA had tried to push me out, to break me, to claim something that wasn't theirs. But in the end, they gave me something they never meant to purpose. Not just to reclaim my land, but to reclaim what it means to live freely, to live honestly, to live with dignity. And as the sky turned from gold to blue to indigo, and the first stars blinked into view over the calm water, I realized something that made me smile. This wasn't just a happy ending. It was the start of a better beginning.